Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, August 29th in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries, encouraged sotto voce by our government, as an excuse, not the reason, for the wars. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran. The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. Aware was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but is in fact killing people in order to control Middle East oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over our economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to 1. Establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2. End the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3. Cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Russia has 15, China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the world's countries. 4. Stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5. Lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight, and we'll begin with David Johnson, the proprietor of the Illinois World Labor Hour on Radio Free Urbana, WRFU.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Well, lots happened last couple weeks. I guess things have kind of cooled down with this confrontation with North Korea, I guess Steve Bannon resigned from the White House, and now there's talk. In fact, there was rumors about this, and I think it was confirmed, was that there's a deal that's sort of tentatively being worked out to give Eric Prince, the CEO of the Blackwater Mercenary Companies, formerly Blackwater, they've changed their name several times now, a $10 billion contract to basically more or less privatize the war in Afghanistan, which has been going on now for 16 years. So that's one thing that really caught my attention. Now, that hasn't gone through yet, but we'll see what happens. In the meantime, I mean, things are just continuing as usual. It seems like no matter who's elected, same policies more or less continue as is and continue to get worse.
I think it's quite true, and it's. I think the news in that sense is that the conversion of Donald Trump it seems to be complete as far as the war in Afghanistan is concerned. Trump, after all, was elected in part because he attacked the war in Afghanistan. He said we should withdraw. He attacked the interventionist policies, the neoconservative policies of the Obama administration. That was one of the reasons that he became president. And he has gone 180 degrees on that now and is talking about sending more troops to Afghanistan, just as there's a parallel here, of course. I mean, remember, Obama was elected as considered to be the anti-war candidate when he was first elected because he had that pro-war opponent in John McCain. And as soon as Obama got into office, the U.S. sent 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan and expanded the war greatly. Trump, in that regard, elected in part because of his anti-war, anti-interventionist talk, gets into office and immediately sends more troops to Afghanistan and continues the really 8 foreign wars that the U.S. is engaged in. The difference, perhaps, is that the intellectual pacification program that the Obama administration carried out, convincing Americans to ignore this, Trump essentially takes advantage of. People worry about Trump's mental health and personal relations, but not the fact that he's killing people around the world the same way Obama did. So yeah, that is quite something. You mentioned Steve Bannon, Trump's evil genius, according to some people. I think the interesting thing, perhaps, to note about Bannon is that he was the major voice against the war. Against the carrying on of the wars that the Obama administration passed on to the Trump administration, and that his dismissal, apparently what it was in fact a rejection of the anti-war sentiments that Trump had expressed, and the embrace of the globalist view represented by other members of the Trump administration that wished to carry on the war. Most notably, the National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, James Mattis in the Defense Department, and the new Kelly, the new Chief of Staff. I mean, we have essentially a military junta running the wars that the Obama administration ran, and the perhaps embarrassing interlude of Donald Trump and Steve Bannon is over. And that's all we have to look for. In fact, it was Bannon's idea, I think. Bannon, in order to oppose the expansion of the war in Afghanistan, he, in fact, was the source of the suggestion of privatizing it.
Yes.
And that something quixotic about it, if nothing more. But still in all, it was in opposition to what has actually happened. That is the continuation of the Obama war policies in Afghanistan.
Carl, that may be the case. And also, I have to say that he did come out opposed to some of the rhetoric that was being used against North Korea, talking about fire and brimstone. However, when it came to Iran, Bannon was an advocate of engaging them more, as far as militarily.
That's what was said.
And also other policies in the Middle East. I mean, it seemed like he was a hawk in the Middle East, and other parts of the world not so much.
Yeah, it's not clear. I mean, Bannon himself was perhaps not. He was given to paradox. He liked to contradict his opponent's views, but was never all that clear about what he was what he was talking about. He, for example, suggested that there was a sort of epical conflict between the U.S. and Islam, and that that was not going to be able to be avoided. The question was how to handle it. He also suggested that the conflict with China, which is in some ways the bedrock of American foreign policy these days, was the preeminent concern, and that was leading inevitably to at least a trade war, if not a shooting war, eventually. So, I mean, the point is that the debate was not carried on openly from the election on. I mean, even Trump's anti-war asseverations during the campaign weren't really taken up on any side. We're much more interested on how Trump treated women, for example. So there is a suppression of serious political questions here that comes finally from the vast agreement within the American political establishment that, of course, we're carrying on these wars in the Middle East, and of course we are opposing China, and of course we're provoking Russia. And when Trump says things that sound like we're not doing that, why, he has to be disciplined pretty quickly, and indeed he has been. So, I mean, I think we're talking more about here the long-term policy of the United States through the last several administrations, and the policy that the Trump administration has been tamed to now. Neoconservatism is one description of the general policy, and I'm afraid that's what we've got.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but Bannon advocated a trade war with China. I
Yeah.
mean,
Oh, yeah.
and,
He thought there was an inevitable conflict with China that would be at least trade, and that may involve much more.
And I think that caused a lot of tension. Besides other things, that led to. I'm not so sure, Carl. It was a dismissal, as back when Obama's administration, Rahm Emanuel was originally the current mayor of Chicago, was originally Obama's White House chief of staff. And then he resigned, and of course I saw all over these so-called progressive websites about how Obama got rid of him, and it's like, no way. Well, he then went back to Chicago, where both him and Obama are from, and ran for mayor and won. And I personally think it was a reassignment. And I think there's a similar phenomenon going on here with Steve Bannon. I think Bannon will definitely made a lot of people angry in the ruling class, in particular this comment about a trade war with China, because let's not forget, corporate America is heavily invested in China and has been for the last 20 years. And they talking about that's going to basically affect their bottom line if a trade war would develop. And I think that was quite a sort of like the I wouldn't say the straw, but the rock that broke the camel's back, in a sense of that this just led to more tensions, and Bannon decided that he just felt probably more comfortable and effective. He goes back to Breitbart News, where he can, have more freedom to, say what he thinks.
I agree with you that China may have been at the root of the matter. I'm not convinced that Bannon's departure doesn't mean a shift by Trump. Indeed, the shift that we saw in regard to the expansion of the war in Afghanistan. As I say, Bannon was one of the people who was trying to get out of the expansion of the war.
Well, at least for the U.S. military, but then he wants to send in mercenaries.
But he's also
paid for taxpayer dollars.
He's also one of the people who was pointing out that the provocations against North Korea were pointless.
Yeah, that's true.
And that since the settled position of the U.S. government, the position of the political establishment, is war provocations against China and Russia, Bannon essentially lost the argument when Trump switched sides. And I think that's the reason he's gone. Now, whether he jumped or was pushed is not clear here.
Okay.
Because what's at stake?
Yes.
What's at stake is the policy that the government is following.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an important point. I think, in many ways, a basic point to what we're looking at. I think we have to realize that the bedrock of American foreign policy, the fundamental assumption of American foreign policy, is opposition to the economic integration of Eurasia. Now, we sometimes don't notice that, but if you pull back far enough so that you get a wide-angle shot here on American history, you'll notice things like the famous open door policy of 1899. More than a century ago, the U.S. looked around and saw that the other imperial powers, notably Germany, were moving into China. And the U.S. and China at the time had a somewhat sclerotic imperial structure, an imperial government which was not very active in resisting that. So the U.S. said, as I say, at the end of the 19th century, the U.S. said, look, economic penetration of China has got to be open to everybody. And by everybody, there's only a few people playing, the British, the Germans, the Americans, and so on. Got to be open for everybody. It can't be closed off. We need an open door into Asia so everybody has an equal chance. Once again, note who everybody is. But still in all, what was at stake was the great fear of the American 1%, as it existed in the 19th century, and it did, that they would somehow be excluded from the economy of Asia. Down the street from, not too far away from where I used to live in Massachusetts, in Milton, Massachusetts, there's something called the Museum of the China Trade, which is a very interesting collection of artifacts of the sorts of things. Remember, New England throughout the 19th century was a major trading center for the United States. I mean, shipborne trade around the world, and a lot of that came from the Far East. My grandfather graduated from the Naval Academy of 1907, and the first thing they did was send him to China, because the Navy knew perfectly well that its graduates needed to deal with the Far East. And that
wasn't long after the Boxer Rebellion.
Exactly, and he had great stories to tell about what the Americans found when they got to the Far East. Until we realize that American foreign policy has always been concerned with the Far East, indeed with Eurasia as a whole, that is Russia and China and the surrounding countries today, I don't think we really see the form of American foreign policy. I mean, after all, what was that unpleasantness with the Japanese about in the 1940s? I mean, the Second World War in the Pacific. What was at stake with Japan, a revived Japanese economy, was establishing what they called a Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which meant, in fact, an economic incorporation of East Asia into a Japanese-run economic union, a trans-Pacific partnership, if you like.
An empire.
An empire.
Yeah.
But an empire, specifically an economic empire, an empire of colonies. And it was Japanese colonialism that the U.S., with this settled position that, an open door into Asia, said, hey, you can't do that, and we will fight you for it. The notion that the U.S. was minding its own business, twiddling its thumbs in Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese decided to have war with the United States is simply false. The U.S. had been contesting in various ways, up to and including actual fighting, the Japanese Greater East Asia Coast Prosperity Sphere long before December 7th, 1941. So the principle of American foreign policy, nobody else runs the Asian economy, if we're not part of it, remained the same. If we look at the sweep of history there was one great bump in the road from the point of view of the United States. It wasn't the Second World War, because the U.S. destroyed the Japanese state in the Second World War. The great bump in the road was the Chinese Revolution in 1949, where an indigenous group of Chinese said, in fact, we are going to organize the economy of China, not the United States. Now, this was the great crisis, indeed, of American foreign policy in the 20th century, much more important than the others. And it was the basis for the Korean War and the Vietnamese War. Until we understand that U.S. concern for Vietnam had nothing really to do with peace, freedom, and justice for the South Vietnamese. What it had to do was the U.S. holding on to the economic control of Southeast Asia, which had fallen in its lap, to screw up the metaphor, with the Second World War. The threat by the Vietnamese to remove their economy from the post-Second World War Asian economy that the U.S. was running and produce a developed society from the anti-colonial struggle that was not part of that American economic hegemony, that we couldn't stand for that.
Yeah.
And so the U.S. attacked South Vietnam in 1962 in order to prevent the independent development of South Vietnam. And the real worry here, as a matter of fact, and this is in the documents of the Kennedy administration, the real worry here was that an independent economic Southeast Asia would eventually influence an independent economic Japan in the 1960s. And we couldn't have that. That was the real nature of the so-called domino theory. You and I are both old enough to, well, you're not as old as I, but we both remember from those days. The dominoes were the East Asian, Southeast Asian, the Asian Pacific economies that could potentially fall out of the control of the United States if the people took their economies into their own hands. We can't have that, said the Americans, and we killed 4 million Southeast Asians to make sure it didn't happen.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, I think historically, British were concerned about this too. I think going back to statements by Churchill and stuff, so we're talking about the early part of the 1900s. However, more recent events, I think, lends a lot of, validity to that analysis in the sense that for the last decade or more, China has been going throughout mostly Latin America, Africa, and other parts of Asia too, and making a lot of business deals with various countries in those regions. And unlike the American model of the past and still the present, Chinese are willing to just keep it specifically to business, the specific business agreement they're entering into. They're not going to try to force the country to, change their political systems, change their economic system or anything else. And this is very clever, the Chinese, not done to be so heavy-handed like the American ruling class has been going back, over a century, in which they're, they don't like a government that's elected in Latin America in particular. They would resort to anything from rigged elections to murder of the elected leader to outright invasions. Exactly. And I think the other thing and I think the U.S. is worried about this because, it's obviously these countries would rather do business, with the Chinese because they're not so heavy-handed. The other thing I think of, too, that's worrying the American ruling class is this whole, China's slowly and systematically building a very clean energy, self-sufficient energy grid. I mean, they're not there yet, but they're basically well on their way with solar, wind, and other technologies. And last but not least, the high-speed rail network that they've been building, which is going to go all the way to Tehran in Iran here before too long, and they have even hopes of taking it all the way to Berlin. The new Silk Road, if you will. Now, if you don't think that has the American ruling class concerned, yeah, definitely.
I think you're absolutely right about that, and that is something that I'm always surprised that so many Americans seem not to have heard of.
Well, it's not like it's covered in the that much in the U.S. Media. Of course.
Exactly, it isn't, and particularly during the presidency of President Xi, China has been immensely active in establishing what they called for a while the One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road, as you say. I was interested to see that not too long ago the Chinese decided that they would abandon the One Belt, One Road name for this development and use the phrase in English, the Belt Road Initiative. Belt and what they're referring, the Belt refers to maritime connections, a sea belt, in other words, connecting East Asia to Europe, and the road is the overland route you're talking about, some of which is in place and more of it is being built right now. The Belt and Road Initiative is a tremendous project on the part of the Chinese government, and the U.S. it flies in the face of what I said earlier was the bedrock principle of American foreign policy, that no one should organize the economic integration of Asia without American participation. That's exactly what the Chinese are doing, and they're doing it with a remarkable degree of inventiveness, as you say, on things like power. I'm supposed to go to China next month, and I hope to have a chance to ride a bullet train for the first time.
Okay.
American trains, we know, are basically 19th century devices, and the Chinese rail system is already remarkably different from what we're familiar with. The Chinese economic integration, and remember that this occurs in partnership with Russia. I mean, President Putin was talking not long ago about an integrated Eurasia from Lisbon in Spain to Vladivostok in eastern Russia, Pacific Russia. Now, this is the sort of things that they're thinking about in Washington, the State Department, in various ways, and in some sense what the argument in the Trump administration was about. How is that going to be countered? And the corporate globalists, for lack of a better name for this group, represented by people like Gary Cohn, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration, are determined to maintain the sort of neoliberal policies that American governments have followed for 40 years, which means essentially corporate control of the world economy, particularly in regard to the exploitation of labor. The point of one of the principal points of neoliberalism was to undercut unions, undercut labor demands, and the last 40 years by seeking out foreign places where the labor questions could be handled more easily from the point of view of the owners.
Sure.
Now, it's this principle, this policy, at the heart of American government for more than a generation, that was being challenged in some ways by what was called Trump's economic nationalism, where he said, no, Americans have had their jobs taken away, Americans are hurting on this matter, and Trump is president because enough Americans heard that and said, yeah, that's right. I know what my situation is. I know what's happening to me. I know how my life chances are different from my parents' life chances, and I know that's a result of government policy. We want some policies that will bring back the sort of prosperity of 40 years ago that American labor knew.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, control of cheap labor, control of natural resources.
Exactly.
You know, that's the bottom line, of course, for the American 1%, the neoliberals. Yeah, well, Trump, you know, that's a good point because I saw an interview with Robert Scheer, who used to be a journalist for the LA Times for a couple decades.
Yeah.
And, then started Truth Out, this one excellent website that's been called fake news by the corporate interests, of course. Anything that goes against corporate media is fake news. You know, they lump it in the category with, you know, really, you know, truly off the wall stuff that has no basis in fact. But nevertheless, Truth Out's a really good source. And Robert Scheer, the editor of that site, was interviewed on the Real News Network, and they were asking about, you know, Trump's rise to the president, and he was saying, look, he goes, you know, there's a lot of people out there in America that are hurting. And it was basically that he appealed to basically their insecurities, their real insecurities about, you know, their health care, being able to afford health care if they even have it, having a decent paying job, because so many jobs, thanks to Bill Clinton, and you know, also, you know, the first George Bush, you know, the second George Bush, and even Obama, so many good paying jobs have been outsourced through these free trade agreements.
Precisely.
I mean, we've lost, I've seen upwards of 12 million jobs that were lost, and these were good paying manufacturing jobs, most of them union, that were lost because of the North American Free Trade Agreement. You know, the problem, of course, is that Trump's, his solutions are not the right ones. But he's definitely, the reason he got elected was he's appealing to these real concerns of the many of the people out there. But
That's
anyway,
right. That's the point.
yes,
I think that's
yes.
right.
And the thing is about, a lot of people try to dismiss this whole thing about, the United States, trying to, overthrow governments, just for the economic interests of the elites. But, there's a couple of cases in point that are more recent that show that's still the case. Particular most recent one was the military coup in Honduras in 2009,
Absolutely.
in which Hillary Clinton was head of the State Department, who they first tried to deny they had anything to do with it, but then WikiLeaks released a bunch of State Department cables that proved that they were, behind it all the way and encouraged it. And the reason they did the military coup against the elected Honduran president Zelaya was because, one, Zelaya wanted to make changes to the Constitution that would more empower the ordinary people in the sense, creating more democracy. And the second thing was he wanted to raise the minimum wage by about 50%. And those two things, the American 1% and other corporate interests, just would not stand for. The other more recent example, which was a little older than the Honduran one, is the invasion of Haiti in 2004. When the elected president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was basically forced out of the presidential palace at gunpoint by the 102nd Airborne Division, put on a U.S. transport plane, him and his family, and dumped in the Central African Republic. Same situation there. Reason they did that was because Aristide wanted to raise corporate taxes by 10% and increase the minimum wage by about, I think, 30%. And again, that just wouldn't fly. So yeah, we've got plenty of examples. This is not some old gunboat diplomacy. This is still the operating procedure of the American ruling class in terms of its relations with lesser developed countries.
This is certainly true, and of course you mentioned earlier the paramount example of that, or where these days, which of course is Venezuela.
Yes.
Where the U.S. is attempting to do the same thing in a very costly encouraged insurrection by the well-to-do, so to speak. There is an extremely good article, by the way, on the Counterpunch website today about the situation in Ecuador.
Oh, yes.
Ecuador has, we have a peculiar connection here at the University of Illinois to Ecuador, in that the splendid president of Ecuador recently departed from that office. Rafael Correa was educated here in the economics department. Now, for good or ill, I don't know how much good it did him, but what he did was a great deal of good for for Ecuador. His successor may not be the man that Correa was, and that doesn't look good at all, but it's a situation in which the U.S. is desperately interested in the same way that it's interested in Honduras and Venezuela. Venezuela, in some ways, is top of the list for the U.S. because so much of our own energy resources comes from Venezuela. The U.S. is certainly concerned, as you suggested, that we have control over this situation, and the Chavez episode in the history of Venezuela was a profound threat to the U.S. The U.S. has been working very hard to make sure it's not repeated in Venezuela or elsewhere in Latin America. And it fits in with the same pattern, with the same policies, call them neoliberal for lack of a better name, that the U.S. government is spreading around the world. A very bad deal indeed.
Yes, in fact, just a little recent history. I mean, there was quite a few countries during the beginning of the late 90s and all through the 2000s in Latin America that were able to elect a very good governments that really represented the people. You had that as a case in Venezuela with the first election of Hugo Chavez in '98, then later in Ecuador with Carrera, later in Bolivia with Evo Morales, and then even in Argentina with Kirchner, in Brazil with Rousseff, even for a while in Chile with, I can't remember her name.
Take it a minute, yes.
Yeah, Michelle something. I'm sorry, and also there was election of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. And also a priest, an ex-priest actually in Paraguay, and I believe there was also a fairly good government in Uruguay for a while. So there was for a period there for about 7-8 years. I mean, almost the majority of Latin America had good governments that were democratically elected, and they were actually working for the interests of the people, as opposed to the leaders lining their own pockets with bribes from corporate interests. But unfortunately, empire struck back. I mean, I think the only thing that kept these governments, the majority of them, going for so long was because of the preoccupation being tied down in the Middle East. Well, now the empire has gotten a little more secure control for at least the time being, and they have struck back. They undermined. It was a parliamentary coup in Brazil. They got rid of Rousseff. A neoliberal has been reelected in Argentina. The priest in Paraguay was undermined also by a parliamentary coup. And your recent example of Ecuador. Now, Venezuela. I mean, the international corporate media coverage of what's been going on down there has just been horrible. Horrible. I mean,
not by accident.
Corporate media is, you got to be suspicious of it to begin with. But with Venezuela, I mean, it is blatant, outright lies. I mean, first of all, I challenge anyone to tell me when the United States has ever truly been concerned about democracy and human rights. Never. Ever has that been the case. That's what they say, but why is it we back governments like Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Colombia? I mean, I could go on and on and on, both currently and historically, of all these extremely anti-democratic governments that have horrible human rights abuses. It's just the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. But the fact is that people should be aware of this. That this is what this is all about. This is why. I mean, why did the United States normalize relations with Cuba, and then within a matter of days, all of a sudden declare Venezuela the biggest threat to so-called U.S. national security, whatever that means, because it's definitely not threatening the American people, maybe threatening the profits of the 1% ruling class, is the fact that Venezuela sits on the largest known oil reserve in the world at this point in time, and they're just not willing to play ball with these corporate interests. They basically want to do what's right for their own people, and that's when countries start being called dictators and human rights abusers, because let's not forget, every single election that Venezuela's had, starting with the 98 election of Hugo Chavez, have had international monitors. In fact, I challenge anybody to compare what the election standards are in Venezuela compared to here in the United States, especially this last election in 2016.
Yeah, I think
what I mean to say is, let me finish, is that our election standards are some of the worst in the world. I mean, if you compare it to other industrialized countries, to say we have a democracy is very marginal, to say the least. I mean, we've got, so many people that are disenfranchised from voting. There's been so many, there's been outright election fraud in this country. This last 2016, particularly in the Democratic primaries, with Bernie Sanders being, a victim of massive voter disenfranchisement in especially California and New York, and then later outright election fraud. Not to mention the use of Greg Palass's wonderful documentation of the use of what they call cross-check voting, to where they disenfranchise people because their name happens to match someone else's name that had a felony in another state. I mean, these things, are just fly in the face of any pronouncements of being a democratic country.
And the only problem, I agree, of course, that the sorts of things that have been talked about voter manipulation in the U.S. Are quite outrageous. The problem is that that's part of a system that presents you a choice between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump to begin with.
Indeed.
So even if we had a perfectly formal, careful election, that is, everybody who had a right to vote got to vote.
Every adult over 18, regardless.
Exactly. But even if you had that, you would still have Clinton versus Trump. And there are other problems to be dealt with. Not that these problems are not to be dealt with, but they may not be the root of the problem. I think you're closer to it in what you were saying earlier about the control of the information that most Americans get. Americans are on the whole shockingly ignorant of what is going on in this country and in the world at large, not because Americans are racially or any other way more stupid than people in the rest of the world, but because Americans live within a system of propaganda control, of information control, that's, it's said that water is the last thing a fish would ever discover, huh? In some ways, the information regime that Americans live in is the last thing we ever discover because it's so pervasive. It's there all the time. We swim in it, and therefore, naturally we know that there are communists in Vietnam who are trying to take over Vietnam, and therefore we've got to send troops to kill Vietnamese. I mean, it's not even an issue, not even a question. I use a long ago example because I'm old, but there are plenty of other examples like that. And it's the information regime that the U.S. I mean, this has a history. At the end of the 19th century, the U.S., beginning of the first decade of the 20th century, 100 years ago, the U.S. was confronted by serious demands by workers and others for a more just society. There was a serious socialist movement in America in the first decade of the 20th century, and it was only encouraged by the Russian Revolution and the triumph of the Leninist party in Russia. The U.S., which had a bloody labor history up to that point, one of the bloodiest in the world, really decided that they couldn't possibly suppress the sorts of demands for social justice that were coming across the country, from across the country, in the decade before the First World War. The notion, and it was a conscious decision, was that people had to be convinced that things were okay, or there were other problems we had to deal with. For example, we've got to get into that war in Europe. Most Americans had no interest in being involved in the war, the First World War and the war in Europe, because there were the social problems here at home to deal with. The brilliance of the Wilson administration was actually to establish a propaganda commission. They didn't call it that.
Creel Commission, I believe?
Yes. Whose job was to convince America, if you couldn't control Americans by the police baton and the jail cell, you had to control America by information. You have to control Americans by saying the U.S. is under attack by the German Empire. We have to fight. We have to aid the forces of freedom in Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the stuff that we all grew up with. Well, that only increased throughout the century when the social demands, the demands of social reform of Americans, were often turned into questions of foreign issues. At the end of the Second World War, many Americans said, okay, that's good, we got rid of those fascist powers, now let's make the sorts of changes in this country that we need to do to include everybody. The American government sort of scratched its head and said, oh, gee, we'd like to, but the communists will take Connecticut if we do that. Therefore, we've got to fight the communists. We've got to have a Cold War around the world. By the way, let's fight them in Korea, let's fight them in Vietnam, so forth and so on. So, I mean, the questions of war, of American war in the 20th century, questions of war even in the last decades, are tightly bound up with social reform in the United States. We can't afford single-payer health care in the United States because we have a $600 billion military budget. This is not new. This has been the American stance all along. These questions are all bound up together. The old SDS motto, everything is connected, is exactly right when we come to talk about propaganda, social reform, and war in the United States.
Yes, nothing like a good war to distract from domestic problems.
Exactly.
And you know, this is typical of the ruling class in this country, both currently and historically, is divert, distract, disinformation. These are tools, and they use them, unfortunately, very effectively. Historically, since we're coming into Labor Day here, I want to mention, first of all, about, the First World War. There was a very well-known and well-beloved Union leader named Eugene Debs from Terre Haute, Indiana, not too far from here, who was, he was the president of the National Railroad Workers Union, was involved in one of the biggest strikes in American history back in 1894 called the Pullman Strike, which happened in Chicago. Very bloody strike. They sent in federal troops and killed hundreds of workers and wounded scores of others to break the strike. And about 20-some years later, when, as you said, Carl, World War I was already started in Europe, but the Americas hadn't gotten involved yet. And the vast three-quarters of the American people didn't want to get involved in that war. But lo and behold, establishment of Wilson's Creel Commission with the help of a man named Edward Bernays, who is the father of the American public relations industry in this country, within a matter of a year was able to turn that public opinion around from 75% opposed to almost that same amount being in favor of going into war. And lo and behold, it happened in April of 1917. Well, Eugene Debs made a speech in Ohio stating that working people should not go to Europe and fight in a war that's just going to basically make a bunch of rich people richer. He was brought up on sedition charges, tried and sentenced to federal prison. And he was there for quite a few years. While he was there, he actually ran for president and got 2 million votes from a jail cell in Atlanta. 2 million votes at that time was a fairly significant percentage of the vote, actually. So this is an interesting history here about, as you pointed out, Carl, about as social demands are increasing in this country to try to improve the lives of Americans, the ruling class will do whatever it takes to try to either subvert those demands in one way or another. And of course, wars have been an effective tool, either cold or hot wars, to do just that.
The example of Debs in the First World War is extremely important because it tells us once again that the fundamental political stance of Americans at large, has always been anti-war. We have no examples of Americans rising up and saying, we've got to go fight those other people, with one overwhelming and horrible exception, and that being the Indian Wars. Mm-hmm. Every time else where the U.S. is being sent abroad to, where American soldiers are being sent abroad into wars, there has been a tremendous resistance to it, sometimes as clever, as insightful, as principled as Eugene Debs, but other times, for most people saying, what do we have to do with that? That's not our concern. We shouldn't be concerned about that. And the principal job of American war leaders, including Wilson and Roosevelt and Kennedy and others, has been to convince Americans, oh yes, we've got to do this some way or another. There are good reasons for it, and I'll tell you what they are later. In the meanwhile, Johnny got his gun. And this is this, unfortunately, is a history of a century of American war making in which the United States has been the perpetrator of vast international crimes, particularly since the U.S. emerged as the only undamaged country from the Second World War in 1945. Everything since then can be laid at the door of the United States as the principal perpetrator of international war. Mm-hmm. If the U.S. is involved, there are others who are far too willing to fall in line. You mentioned the British earlier, for example. But the fact of the matter is, it's the American ruling class that insisted upon it. One of the most cogent analysts of American policy, policy that he was very much involved in constructing, was George Kennan, a diplomat and historian, who wrote in 1948, we have 6% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth. The rest of the world is not going to be very happy with that, and we are going to have to find ways to make sure that we can, and this is his phrase, maintain the disparity. He said we have to give up notions of universal benefaction and human rights. We have to essentially make war to hold on to what we have. Well, that's the history of American war making in my lifetime, mm-hmm. and the situation has a remarkable sameness to it against our notion that everything that occurs now has no precedent. In fact, it does.
Yeah, and that 50% wealth, I mean, that's mainly at the top of the pyramid in the society.
Of course, when I say the Americans had that, I
Yes.
mean, yes, it was not evenly divided among the Americans, then or now. In fact, the interesting point was that in the generation after the Second World War, it did become more evenly divided, in part because of the demands of Americans saying, what were we fighting for? And we have a period that the economic historian Piketty calls the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years from 1945 to 1975, when the rebuilding from the Second World War meant a growing, the better way to say it is a lessening inequality amongst Americans. That turned around in the 1970s. That's what neoliberalism was about. The neoliberal policies that you were describing earlier were designed to make that tendency towards equality reverse, and indeed it did. Inequality began to grow, not recede, in the 1970s, and began to accelerated in the next 40 years to the point we have now, where the U.S. is strikingly more unequal than it was in 1975. This is and that, by the way, is what elected Donald Trump, as you suggested earlier. The recognition by Americans of their growing immiseration led them to look for various ways in which that could be countered.
And look at the choices, like you pointed out too, Carl. I mean, the American people in the general election had a choice between two of the most despicable people imaginable, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And I think the real story that, of course, is avoided at a lot of costs is the fact that 46% of the American elected chose none of the above, either by not voting at all or voting for third parties or leaving the race on the presidency blank and going on to vote for lower offices on the ticket. That's a story that's not talked about. Of course, a lot of the stories are saying that Donald Trump got elected because he's a racist, but if you break the data down, I went back and looked at the data all the way back to 1998. The same percentage of white people, give or take 1%, voted for Donald Trump this time as did for every other Republican president going back to 1998, midterms and presidential elections. And this racist supposed reason that all these people all of a sudden decided that they wanted to vote for Donald Trump because they were racist is the fact that how do you explain the fact that 29% of Latino voters, 29% of Asian, and even 10% of African American voters voted for Donald Trump? And every time I've thrown that out, people are just, they try to change the subject. That's the whole point here, is that most of the people, the vast majority of the voters chose none of the above. Of many people out there that did vote, they thought that, well, we know what the Clintons have done in the past. We had NAFTA, we had the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which eventually caused the 2008 financial collapse. You had the criminalization, greatly expansion of the, incarceration state, people being put in prisons for the smallest offenses, usually nonviolent drug offenses, and I could go on and on and on. And Hillary Clinton, didn't really inspire too many people running around in $5,000 Armani suits. And frankly, Trump attacked Hillary Clinton from the left. He pushed on NAFTA.
That's right.
He, about the repeal of NAFTA. He pushed on good-paying jobs. Now, whether he meant it or not, I kind of doubt it. But nevertheless, Hillary Clinton wouldn't, take on those issues. In fact, in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders was taking up a lot of these issues, much to the, frustration of Hillary Clinton, who slowly, during the course of the primaries until she stole the election, basically, her and the DNC, would start trying to agree with Sanders. Not to say that she was convinced, but just the fact that she knew that these issues like single-payer health care and increase the minimum wage, free college tuition, like most countries in the industrialized world have, were actually getting resonance, that this was really the majority opinion. And this is something that politicians do a lot of times, is they'll pretend to support an issue when in fact they don't until the threat is gone. And this is, in my opinion, what happened and why we're in the situation we are now. But it's interesting, Carl, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, it seems like no matter who's elected, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, the same policies continue.
Yes, exactly.
So what's that tell you, folks? What's that tell you?
There is an interesting article by Chris Hedges, who has been writing well on American politics for a long time, that I will put on the Facebook page for Aware.
Oh, yes.
The title is How Antifa Mirrors the Alt-Right. Behind the rhetoric of the alt-right about white nativism and protecting American traditions, history, and Christian values is the lust for violence. Behind the rhetoric of Antifa, the black bloc and the so-called alt-left about capitalism, racism, state repression, and corporate power is the same lust for violence. The two opposing groups, largely made up of people who have been cast aside by the cruelty of corporate capitalism, have embraced holy war. Their lives, battered by economic misery and social marginalization, have suddenly been filled with meaning. They hold themselves up as the vanguard of the oppressed. They arrogate to themselves the right to use force to silence those they define as the enemy. They sanctify anger. They're infected with the dark, adrenaline-driven urge for confrontation that arises among the disenfranchised when a democracy ceases to function. They're separated, as Sigmund Freud wrote of those who engage in fratricide, by, quote, the narcissism of minor differences, close quote. They mirror each other, not only ideologically, but also physically, armed and dressed in black, the color of fascism and the color of death. It was inevitable that we would reach this point. The corporate state has seized and corrupted all democratic institutions, including the two main political parties, to serve the interest of corporate power and maximize corporate profits. There is no justice in the courts. There is no possibility of reform in the legislative bodies. Money has replaced the vote. The consent of the governed is a joke. Our most basic constitutional rights, including the rights to privacy and due process, have been taken from us by judicial fiat. The economically marginalized, now a majority of the country, have been rendered invisible by a corporate media dominated by highly paid courtiers spewing out meaningless political and celebrity gossip and trivia as if it were news. The corporate state, unimpeded, is pillaging and looting the carcass of the country and government, along with the natural world, for the personal gain of the 1%. It daily locks away in cages the poor, especially poor people of color, discarding the vulnerable as human refuse. The rest of the article expands upon this horrifying insight that Chris Hedges begins with and discusses the recent events in Charlottesville, Berkeley, and Boston, I must say, in the best way that I've seen them being discussed at all. The article is entitled "How Antifa Mirrors the Alt-Right," and as I say, I will put it on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air.
You know, I've liked Chris Hedges' writings. I loved his book, The Death of the Liberal Class. And also, there was one he wrote not too many years ago. I'm trying to remember the title of Days of Revolt.
Yeah.
I have to say, I adamantly disagree with this recent article by Chris Hedges. I have no use for
the one I was just quoting from?
Yes. Now, what he says, the last part you read, I mean, his analysis is perfect, as usual. But I'm sorry, but you know what? I have no use for Nazis, and when somebody's free speech is basically advocating my right to, the obliteration of my right to exist as an anti-capitalist, as a trade unionist, no, I have no use for fascists. The ruling class have always been behind fascists. You look historically at Hitler, Mussolini, any fascist movement has always had elements of the ruling class behind them. And their whole object is to basically advocate the subjugation of people of color, if not outright murder, likewise murdering of trade unionists, murdering of anybody who criticizes basically capitalism. So, you know what, I know Charlottesville real well. I've seen reports from there, and especially Cornel West, who was on Democracy Now!, said, thank God for the IWW. Thank God for the anarchists, because if it hadn't been for them, when we were surrounded in that church on Friday night by the fascists, who knows what would have happened to us, because we were basically facing threats of physical violence. So, you know, this comparison that Hedges is making, I think, is horrible. His analysis of the system is spot on as usual. But the thing is that this is a tactic. You may not agree with the tactic. If you don't agree with the tactic, then don't participate in it. But when it comes to defending your community against people that want to kill people and harm people like they did in Charlottesville, then I think they have every right to defend themselves.
So you would discard Noam Chomsky's observation that if you don't believe in free speech for people you despise, you don't believe in it at all?
It's not that, Carl. It's just that when free speech by people that are advocating people's murder and basically the destruction of people's right to have trade unions, as people's right to be gay. I mean, this is the thing, is if these people would ever come to power, this is what would happen, because it's, you see what's happened in other countries that fascist movements have come to power.
But that's not an excuse to beat them up or to shut them down.
Yeah, but Carl, they were the ones that came with the heavily armed, and they were the ones that were attacking people.
So Antifa is okay because the alt-right already did it?
No, it's because they're defending people from these fascist thugs.
Well, I don't believe that's what Antifa is doing, but that's clearly the place we should have started today.
I've also got to I talked to a friend of mine on the phone from Oakland Sunday. He was at the both the San Francisco and the Berkeley rallies and stuff, and he was telling me that, you know, even though there was very few fascists that came to there, I mean, they were basically chased off, and, you know, it wasn't like in Charlottesville, but there was none of the violence you had like in Charlottesville, because basically the reason that things happened in Charlottesville is because the fascists, you know, provoked the violence. In fact, as you well know, they killed a 30-year-old woman with a car. And injured 20 other people. And as far as these other people's accounts, like Cornel West's, they would have done a lot more. They also cornered and beat to unconsciousness an African-American teacher in Charlottesville in the parking garage there on the downtown mall. So, I mean, these people they're the ones that are provoking the violence, and the Antifa, I can't count for every single individual member and their actions. However, from what I've seen and heard of what's happened in Charlottesville, they were there to defend people, not provoke violence like the fascists were.
I quoted Chomsky a moment ago. He also pointed out in a recent article that the Antifa is a tremendous gift to the right. And he's correct about that, I think. We should have started there tonight.
Yeah,
You've been watching
so.
Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 35th week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Andrew Scollery, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware, where some of these articles will be posted. There is one announcement. The Vijay Prashad is speaking on the Russian Revolution as the mirror of third world aspirations, which we've touched on tonight. This 7:30 Wednesday, September 6th, in the Spurlock Museum.
Oh,
finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck. And David Johnson, too.